A couple of weeks ago, I of course asked you folks what your favourite circuits were in the entire Gran Turismo series, and I ran through a full list of all of the tracks to appear in Gran Turismo to jog the memories of those of us who maybe couldn't quite remember all of them. There were certainly some which jogged my memory in there, and as recently as yesterday, I went back to revisit those votes in the forms of mentions, top 5s, top 10s, honourable mentions, etc, 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 to break down what are admittedly small slice, of course, of the Gran Turismo community as a whole, voted on as being our collective favourites. And as you would expect, there are some pretty wild results in terms of what people love. Some of the wildest ones to me, though, were the tracks that had no mentions whatsoever. I think the number one which surprised me the most was Road Atlanta. Not a single person in the comments of part 1 mentioned that track, which is crazy to me. But of course there are so many tracks to choose from, so when you really have to narrow it down to a top 10, well, you have to make some cuts here and there. A lot of my personal favourites do appear on this list though, a couple of which really don't surprise me, so let's dive into it. First of all, well, start as you mean to go on, because we have a 5-way tie for 10th place, which is pretty wild. This doesn't happen again on the list in terms of that many different tracks tying. We do have a couple of other smaller ties, but not a 5-way. This one is tied between El Capitan, Infineon, Midfield Raceway, Red Rock Valley, and Special Stage Route 11. What a wild 5-way tie in terms of how many people love these circuits. Of course, Infineon being on the list at all is great. I'd love to see it. For me, it was very highly ranked. The fact that it's in the top 10 at all is awesome, and it does show that a lot of players did at least play the older games, so we have a nice mix of newer players and older as well. Next up in 9th, we go from a 5-way tie to just a single one, but it doesn't actually get less wild, because I thought this was like a dead cert for a top 5, but apparently not. Number 9 is Spa. How insane is that? I would have thought way more people would have had Spa in their top picks, but this is even just based on mentions at all. This is not even based on where people put the tracks, this is just based on mentioning the tracks even. So few people comparatively mention Spa that it ends up in 9th. That is wild. Next up in 8th place though, we have a 3-way tie. And it's another interesting trio because one of them is another one of my favourites. The first one of the trio, though, is crazy to me. I would have never thought that this would be above Spa, that's for damn sure. Autumn Ring. Autumn Ring being above Spa is absolutely insane in my book, but that is actually tied with High Speed Ring, of all places. I mean, talk about a simple circuit, but clearly people really do love it. And the third one, which I'm happy to see here, and amazed, frankly, that it's above Spa, again, Seattle. I mean, that's lovely to see. I'm glad that so many people do clearly love Seattle. Next up in 7th, we have our final tie of the list, from 6th through to 1. They're all single picks, but for number 7 we have an interesting duo between an original circuit and a real circuit, both super iconic though, and it is between Deep Forest and Suzuka, of all places. Now, I seem to recall mentioning something along the lines of feeling that Suzuka was the most famous Japanese or most iconic Japanese track, so it doesn't surprise me at all that it would be on the list. It does kind of surprise me that it's higher than the other ones which we've talked about so far. And in terms of Deep Forest, well, again, it's a very iconic track. I get the impression that a lot of people were skewing more toward the older layout, and of course you can really get into the weeds when you start trying to interpret what different people meant when they said a certain track, so just to keep it simple, I've put old or new both under the blanket of that track, otherwise it gets far too messy. Now though, as we move into that top 6, things get more straightforward because there are no more ties, but that doesn't mean they get less wild. And we'll start as we mean to go on, because talk about an underdog doing well. I'm so impressed, and I'm almost so proud of this track for doing so well. As I was going through tabulating the scores, I kept seeing this name pop up, and it really stood out to me because I didn't expect it to come up so much. Special Stage Route 5, the smallest version of those iconic special stage circuits. I mean, fair play to Route 5. What an underdog of a track to be so high comparatively on the list. If you'd have asked me to bet on this track being on or off the list at all, let alone this high, I don't think I would have bet it to be here at all. Fair play to Route 5, that is very, very cool. Speaking of original circuits though, as we move into the top 5 officially, it's Trial Mountain. That one doesn't surprise me as much in a crazy kind of way because of course it's such an iconic circuit, and as I believe I mentioned in part 1, I do think that Polyphony did a better job of keeping that retro vibe of Trial Mountain, whereas some others like Deep Forest, they kind of lose a little bit of their flair compared to the older games, at least for those of us who prefer the older one. As we move into number 4 though, this one is reminiscent for me of Route 5 in terms of being very surprising, but again, fair play to the track. It's a Tokyo circuit, but it's probably not any of the Tokyo circuits that you're thinking, because in number 4, it's Route 246. I mean, I knew this track had its fans, but talk about fandom. 4th place out of all the, 100 and whatever circuits, that is wild to me that Tokyo Route 246 ranked so high, especially when Tokyo in any other form is not on the list at all. Moving into number 3 though, number 3 and number 2 are both pretty much exactly what you're expecting, but most definitely not in the order that you're expecting, because as I tell you what the next 2 are, you're going to start really scratching your head as to what number 1 could be, because both of these were a couple of my top picks, but like I said, they are not in the order I would have expected. Number 3. Our first podium finisher of the favourite circuits of the community from the whole Gran Turismo series is, of course, Le Mans. Circuit de la Sarthe, in a couple of different forms that were mentioned, be it with or without the chicanes, etc. Le Mans or La Sarthe being in a podium finish doesn't surprise me at all. But if you feel like that is a surprise, wait until you see what number 2 is, because this is wild to me. This is the one which I thought would be number 1. And as I went through the list, noting down how many times it was mentioned, it seemed like it probably would be number 1. But it's number 2. You already know what I'm going to say. Everyone would probably think it was going to be number 1. I certainly had a hunch that it would be. The Nürburgring is number 2. And now that I've said Le Mans in 3rd, Nürburgring in 2nd, you're probably thinking, what on earth is this number 1 going to be? The most mentioned, the highest voted in terms of actual people talking about this, ranking it in their lists, even as honourable mentions, whatever the case may be. What is the most popular Gran Turismo circuit, at least from part 1 of our small sliver of the community? If I gave you all day, I don't think you'd guess it. If you had a list of every circuit, I still don't think you would guess this one. Number 1 is Grand Valley. That is insane to me. How on earth did Grand Valley beat out the Nürburgring and Le Mans to be the number 1 most popular circuit? I think that is absolutely insane. And the fact that it wasn't a tie either, it won by at least a few extra people over the 2nd and 3rd place picks. If you'd have asked me to bet on Grand Valley's placement, honestly, I think I might have said like 9th or 10th. But as I went through, again tabulating them, the Nürburgring really stood out because I expected it to be. Of course, Le Mans showed up again and again and again, as you'd expect, but Grand Valley, I kept noting it down, and I suddenly realised, wow, these tallies are really adding up for Grand Valley, and it wasn't until I counted it up right at the end that I realised, hang on a second, this has the most votes. And this one I find fascinating as a number 1 pick, because between different people's sentiments, you could see a delineation between the old and the new. And that's one reason why this being number 1 actually doesn't annoy me, because I think it's actually quite cool to see how many people were saying that they loved it because they're newer players in the series and they just really like the track. And then you have other people saying they specifically prefer and are voting for the old way, which of course is the same layout, it just looks different. And that is wild as well, because for a track to simultaneously be so divisive between the old and the new, but at the same time be a track where it's mentioned enough as one of people's favourites that it becomes the overall most mentioned and most voted, that's kind of crazy. It's almost like a poetic justice for the track in a crazy kind of way. Like I said at the start of the video, and it can't be reiterated enough, when you have such a massive community, of course, the comments section, the votes were a tiny sample size compared to the community as a whole, and there's nothing really I can personally do to change that. And of course I did some voting polls on the channel a short while ago in the community section, and some of those results were very different to the results here. There were certain tracks which popped up again and again which still didn't quite end up being on the list. One of those, for example, was Complex String, which I saw more people than I expected voting for, but it still wasn't quite enough to be in the top 10. So overall, to me, that is wild. So to run through them just quickly in a recap, 10th is El Capitan, Infineon, Midfield, Red Rock and Route 11. 9th is Spa. 8 is Autumn Ring, High Speed Ring and Seattle. 7 is Deep Forest and Suzuka. 6th is Special Stage Route 5. 5th, Trial Mountain. 4th, Tokyo Route 246. 3rd, Le Mans or Circuit de la Sarthe. 2nd, the Nürburgring. And number 1, Grand Valley. What a wild, crazy and eclectic and unexpected mix of both tracks which you would definitely expect to be in there, and some which I definitely wouldn't have expected, certainly not as high as they were. But of course that's it overall for this discussion. I hope you folks have enjoyed it, and of course weighing in on part 1, we already, as I said, weighed in on the favourite cars of the Gran Turismo community as well, and we may talk about something else in the same vein in future. I certainly have plans to do more community-based discussions because these are a lot of fun, and of course I'll see you next time with more. But for now, thanks for watching.